Hi, my name is Dee Payton. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Howard University. I specialize in analytic feminist philosophy and social metaphysics. And in this short video, I'm going to give you an introduction to the ontology of intersectionality. All right. So just to start off, I'm going to give you a very, very brief history of this notion. So the original notion of intersectionality comes to us from Black feminists who are working to capture the ways that sexism, racism, and classism work together to structure their lives and experiences. So the general idea here is that there are some forms of discrimination that Black women face, which can't be explained by racism, sexism, or classism alone. Now, for some of you, if you're familiar with this concept, you know that lots of times we add other things to this list, not just racism, sexism, and classism, but this is a kind of basic starting point. And while this notion has been present in US Black feminist thought, both inside and outside of the academy for a long time now, the term intersectionality itself was originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in her papers on the marginalization of Black women in feminism, anti-racist politics, and US anti-discrimination law. So the two papers I'm talking about are the ones on the screen. And just to give you a quick sense for how this notion has been employed in practice, I'll talk about the first half of one of these papers. So in demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex, Crenshaw uses the three legal cases I have up on the screen to argue that there is what she calls a single axis framework dominant in US anti-discrimination law, where this single axis framework works to marginalize Black women, among other people. So how does that work? Well, the single axis framework operates with two fundamental assumptions. The first is, if you're discriminated against, you're only ever discriminated against on the basis of sort of one aspect of yourself. So for example, for me as a Black woman, if I'm discriminated against, according to this framework, it's either going to be on the basis of being a woman or being Black. It's never going to be on the basis of some combination of those things. According to the second assumption made by this single axis framework, for any given category, like being a woman, people in that category are always going to be discriminated against in, roughly speaking, the same way. So to illustrate this, we can look at the second legal case up here. So Moore versus Hughes helicopter. The plaintiff in that case, she's a Black woman. She tried to argue that she'd experienced gender discrimination in her workplace. In that case, the court came back and said, well, actually, we don't think you did, because we looked and we found that white women were not discriminated against. So this is how that second assumption in the single axis framework is coming into play. The assumption is, if gender discrimination is present, then Black women and white women alike will experience it. So the court said, because white women weren't discriminated against, there's no way you were discriminated against on the basis of your gender. Okay, unsurprisingly, Crenshaw is going to argue, this is bad, we should not be doing this. And the alternative, of course, is thinking in terms of intersectionality, using this intersectional paradigm. So against assumption one, we take it that, you can be discriminated against on the basis of multiple parts of who you are. So on the basis of being both Black and a woman, for example. And then against the second assumption, we think that discrimination, even on the basis of one way that you are, say being a woman, might be sensitive to other ways that you are, such that, for example, white women and Black women might experience gender discrimination differently because gender discrimination is sometimes informed by your race. Okay, so that's just to give you a sense for how this concept has been employed in practice. But of course, we're here for the philosophy of intersectionality, and specifically the ontology of intersectionality. So just as a brief, disclaimer or thing that might make you excited, the ontology of intersectionality looks very different than a lot of other discussions about intersectionality in academic literatures. We are, of course, doing analytic metaphysics. So let's do that. All right. So intersectionality, I have it in quotes here to mean that I'm talking about a term. It is, among other things, a name for a theory. But of course, natural follow-up question is, a theory of what? What does this theory aim to explain? All right, on the next slide, I'm going to give you a list of questions. These are questions that intersectionality sort of pertains to. They're not the only questions that intersectionality pertains to, but they're supposed to give you an example of the kind of stuff we're talking about. So let's look at those. So why were Black women being laid off at General Motors? This is a question that Crenshaw takes up in one of her papers. That's why I have it here. Why did traditional rape statutes fail to protect Black women? This is another question that Crenshaw addresses in her papers and has also been addressed by Black feminists, for example, Bell Hooks. Why do some Black women feel that the pro-life, pro-choice debate doesn't apply to them? This question is relevant to discussions about reproductive justice. Why are many Black feminists abolitionists? We can look to Angela Davis for discussion of that question. And then, of course, there's questions that don't have to do with Black women specifically, but people in other oppressed social groups. So, for example, why are rates of violence against trans people so high? Trans people of all races. Why are many disabled women prohibited from becoming parents? Why are Black men murdered by police at disproportionately high rates? Okay, here's the claim. Questions like this can't be answered by appeal to race, gender, class, or disability alone. And intersectionality is a theory about why that is, why that's the case. All right. Now moving specifically into the ontology of intersectionality. So we can start here with another basic claim. In many ways, intersectionality is about what it sounds like, intersections. But of course, intersections of what? Okay, so just as a very basic starting point, some things people will list when we're talking about the things that are intersecting here are as follows: race, gender, class, sexuality, disability, nationality, ethnicity, religion. It won't surprise you to learn that this list can get very long. There's many things that people talk about intersecting here, but these are some of the main things that we're concerned with. All right. And now we can start asking the metaphysical questions. So really, maybe obvious question right off the bat, what are these things? So what is race, sort of generally as a kind of just, I guess, general phenomenon, general structure, category? What sort of thing is race? We can ask more specifically, what is it to be a member of a particular racial group or particular racial category, have a particular racial identity? And we have this kind of structure for the other things on that list too. So for example, what is gender? General phenomenon, gender structures, what sort of thing in general is gender? But then more specific questions. What is it to be a woman? What is it to be a man? What is it to be a non-binary, genderqueer, etc.? We can do this for every other thing on that list. What is class? What is disability? Goes on. I have here on the right side of the screen some texts that are frequently engaged with in the analytic literatures in these discussions. But as you might imagine, there's a lot. There's a lot on these on this stuff, and all of it, in my opinion, is very interesting. So we have these questions about, what are the things on the list? We can ask a kind of more fundamental metaphysical question, though, and this is about what sorts of things those are. So kind of like, what ontological category do those things belong to? Are they, for example, identities? We talk a lot about identities in literature on intersectionality. Are they categories? Lots of times we talk about socially constructed categories. So here, the metaphysics of social construction is going to be relevant. Love that stuff. Properties. Yeah, so I have here red apples. So being red is a property had by those apples. But of course, we're not interested so much in properties like being red here, but instead properties like being a woman, being gay, being disabled. Okay. Sometimes we're also talking about social structures. So white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, for example, and how those social structures come together. And then many times we're talking also about experiences. You'll hear people talk about, for example, intersecting social structures, producing intersectional experiences. Like, for example, if you're a Black woman living in the US, dealing with white supremacy and sexism, the combination or the intersecting of those structures will give you, sometimes people talk about intersectional experiences, like being a Black woman is an intersectional experience. Okay. And then, depending on what you think of the metaphysics of each of these things, there's actually, going to be some overlap here. So maybe identities just are socially and politically significant categories. Maybe categories are just collections of people who share a property in common. Maybe those people have the property because they are living with certain social structures which produce in them certain experiences. So, there's lots of ways to talk about how these things might be related. That brings us to the next set of questions. what is the nature of this intersectional relationship? So we can ask about, what is race? What is gender? We can ask deeper ontological questions about what sorts of things race and gender are. And then we can also ask about how different elements of an intersectional picture might be related. So for example, are they adding together? Is this some kind of like atomistic elements that are, adding up to some more complex picture? Is it some other metaphysical relationship? Are we talking about grounding, supervenience, causation? For example, are they different parts of the same whole? Maybe the picture looks like this, or like this. There's a lot of different options here. I think one thing worth highlighting here is that in discussions about the metaphysics of intersectionality, it has happened that sort of the idea that we can even pull apart distinct elements of the picture that's been challenged. So how much does it make sense to ask, for example, about the nature of race alone and the nature of gender alone, and then say, okay, now that we've got sort of like each element neatly packaged, how do we bring them together? Like that's one way to approach it. But that has also been, questioned basically. Can we kind of like pull apart each individual element and then see how they relate to each other, or are they sort of essentially kind of bound up in each other such that you can't really pull apart each aspect of the picture? But just to give you an example of one way people have talked about this, so Sarah Bernstein in a recent paper has argued that intersectional categories are explanatorily prior to their constituents. So Bernstein is talking about the elements of the intersectional picture being categories, and then the relationship that they bear to each other is one of explanatory priority. So this is a project which focuses on the nature of this intersectional relationship between elements of the picture. Okay. And then maybe moving away from just straight metaphysics, we can also ask kind of about how general this theory is, or which things this theory is designed to apply to. So to give you a sense for this, we can ask, is it specific to Black women? Referencing the genealogy of this concept. Is it specific to Black people, people of color, colonized peoples? Maria Lugones has some really awesome work on the coloniality of gender. And one of the things that she argues for in that work is that European gender systems have been used to oppress Black and brown colonized peoples on the basis of their race. So in that case, we have kind of a set of norms and gender structures in one domain being used to oppress people in another domain, namely on the basis of race. So some people have argued that's one way you can understand intersectionality, specifically pertaining to this experience had by Black and brown colonized peoples. Is it specific to women and gender minorities? So this question gets at that list I had up earlier, race, gender, class, disability, et cetera. And then the question is, are any of the items on that list kind of fixed? They have to be there when we're talking about intersectionality. So for example, if you think gender is always part of what we care about when we're doing intersectional theory, that means that you can't really talk about just the intersection of disability and religion, for example, because again, on this kind of view, gender's got to be there. So we have these kind of questions about which elements of this list of politically and socially relevant identities or properties or categories, et cetera, have to be there, which, if any, and that's going to determine sort of what this theory applies to. But then, of course, you could just say it's very general, and in some sense, this theory is about everyone, and so it doesn't really make sense to talk about one item on that list or one or another item being fixed. It's just sort of about, I don't know, this general coming together of these social and properties or categories and how that works. All right. So yeah, kind of in that spirit and wrapping up here, just this goes beyond metaphysics, I think, a little bit. So intersectionality has come to name many different theories with different explanatory aims. This depends a little bit on how you individuate theories, but this is one way you can describe it. So theories, it's named theories about the general combination of any identities and any struggles that result. This is a very general approach. It's named theories about the particular struggles of people of color against colonizing systems. That's the thing I was talking about with Maria Lugones and the coloniality of gender. And of course, it's also named theories about Black women in our struggle against anti-Black racism, capitalism, classism, and white supremacy. Okay, this is, and I'm sure it's named other, theories with other explanatory goals. One thing I think this brings out is that there are interesting normative questions here about what we want intersectionality to explain. What should this theory explain? And then also whether anything is lost when one explanatory goal comes to take precedence over the others. So if you've done a little social ontology, social metaphysics, yes, lots of times we're asking the straight up direct metaphysics questions about what grounds what, et cetera. But many times in the social disciplines, the political and obviously social aspects of the phenomena we're working with are relevant and inform the metaphysics. And I think philosophy of intersectionality is a paradigm example of this. You have a theory which has been developed by a minority group of people, Black feminists in the US, to describe specifically their experiences. But then it also can be generalized and to talk about obviously more than just Black women's experiences. But I think that kind of dynamic, at least, I don't know, in this context, raises some really interesting and important normative questions about what we're doing with the theory. And yeah, okay. I think that's all I've got for you. Thanks very much.